Hey everyone, this is Remy. Today I'm going to show you how to make a simple REST server in Rust using the library called warp. Let's get to it. So first of all, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to create a new Rust project by simply typing in cargo new, and let's call it warp sample. Let's cd into it. Open it up in your favorite editor and let's get cracking. First, you're going to want to add some dependencies. Tokyo is used for the async runtime for Rust. Warp itself serves as the warp server that provides the listener and the endpoints. Saturday is a library that can convert Rust structs to JSON objects and vice versa. Saturday JSON is a helper library to it. Request is useful for headers, and anyhow is useful for error handling. Let's get to it. Open up main.rs and add the following function to it. The following function is just called JSON body, and it serves as a wrapper, which can wrap a Rust struct and deserialize it into a JSON object, which will allow us to actually accept JSON objects and then manipulate the data within them as Rust structs. Content size, it's something that this takes as an argument, and basically what it means is the amount of bytes that you're going to be sending over in your requests. This is entirely flexible, and if your requests will be larger, simply increase this number. What you're going to want to do also is you're going to want to import all of these dependencies. So warp filter. And let's get an actual function that will serve as our endpoint. The function is going to be called getUser because in most use cases, you just want to fetch users. In most CRUD applications, you just want to get users, you want to register users, you want to update users, and you want to delete users. Almost all of the web applications need this functionality. So this is what I decided to use as an example. So the path is going to be get user, which will basically mean, like, for example, if you're running it, it's going to be localhost, and the the endpoint is going to be /get user. That's what we define in here without the slash. Then we have we define the type of the request. It's gone so first we define the end definition of the path, so this is what ends, there is no more. Then we define the definition of the request with the type of the request, which is post. Then we define the type of argument that it accepts as a JSON, and it will accept a struct called user request, which we haven't yet defined, but we will in a second. Then it accepts the headers from wherever you call in this function from, be it Postman or the front end. And then it takes as an argument the actual function which this endpoint is going to be invoking, and then returning whatever the return type of this function is back to the user invoking the endpoint. So let's define the struct called, let's first import box filter, because this is something we import from the warp library. It's as simple as that. And then let's define the struct called user request. Now, how do we find the users normally? Well, we want to find them by either the user ID or the user email. In our case, let's go ahead and do it by user ID. So here we are, user request, and it just takes user email. It just takes the email as a string. So the email is of type string, and this is what this function is going to take as the endpoint. And you'll see when we finish this, you will see how we will pass this as a JSON object. A JSON object will just contain an email of type string. So we gotta import serialize and deserialize, and we need these traits in order to be able to actually use Saturday and serialize / deserialize them, and then use that data. Now let's define the actual function, which will be called the handler. So we will wanna, the handler will obviously wanna fetch the user based on the email. If the user exists, then we'll wanna return that user. If the user does not exist, we'll wanna return an error saying that the user does not exist. So let's put it underneath here. The function is called getUserHandler. As a request, it will take user request struct, and it will take some headers, which it will take some headers, and then it will invoke a function called find user, which we will define in a second. And the response will be if the find user function returns the status OK, meaning that it has found the user, then we will return the result. Then we will return the result of the successful result of that function as a reply back to the user calling this endpoint. Otherwise, if the find user function returned an error, meaning it did not find the user, we will return whatever status we want. In this case, I chose internal server error, which is the status 500, along with the message, again, fetched from the find user function. So let us define the find user function. Find user function will normally, in most applications, be calling an endpoint to fetch users from the database and look from there. But I'm not going to go into databases in this tutorial. This tutorial is only going to focus on the actual web API server. So let's define a function called find user. And within this function, we just hardcode the user, and we'll hardcode the user with an email. So let us define the struct called user. Let us import the result. Can I import this? I just import it manually because sometimes the VS Code does not suggest the correct import. So anyhow, and you just want to do this result, and anyhow, this is all you want to import. So now this has stopped complaining. Then we want to import header map. This is the request headers. And then we're gonna want to import all of the other little dependencies so that it stops complaining. Okay, we're gonna want to remove this await because find user is not an async function. And then let's examine the find user function. So we got a hard-coded user. This is to avoid going to the actual database. This simulates the database. Basically, we have a user, and the user's email is someone@email.com. Perfect. Then what the function does, it matches email provided in its parameter, and it checks if the email is equal to the email of the hard-coded user. If it does equal, which means if it's true, then we will return an OK status along with user found .toString as the result. Otherwise, we'll return an error status along with an error called user not found, which is a string. So this is the find user function, and as it's called here, we will basically return the response of this function back to the user. So it'll be either user found or user not found, depending on the email provided. Now let's define the actual main method so we can run the application and see for ourselves. So the main function will be, we'll of course have to delete the previous main function. The main function will be, so we'll just print a message saying that the warp server is running on whatever port we've defined. So the port we've defined will be 3030. Let's just quickly put it above that line. And then we'll serve the routes on the local host, which is 127.0.0.1, and the port, which we've defined as 3030. We also need a function called routes. So this function is an endpoint for warp, but we'll also need to invoke it somewhere. So let's fetch the function called routes, which will invoke that endpoint as a warp API. Let's put it right here. So all this does is basically it returns a boxed filter as a reply, and it takes in get user, which is this function, and you just have to do .boxed, which will make this available for us to be calling it via an API. And this is it. This is a simple warp server. Let's just quickly, because we don't need the headers, since we're not making an API request to a database, we'll just put a little underscore next to the argument. This means that the argument is not used. It's allowed to be here, but it's an unused argument. So we'll just basically stop the compiler from complaining that it's there. Other than that, this is it. Now we're just gonna go ahead and run our application by running cargo run. It's gonna take a minute or so to build all of the dependencies, and then it's gonna run. And then we'll invoke the application from Postman and see what happens. All right, as you can see, we have successfully run our server on port 3030. So now let's go to Postman and actually call the API. So let's call the endpoint using the correct email address, someone@email.com. Let's send that request. As you can see, the response we got says user found as defined here. User found, this is what we're getting. Now let's make an incorrect email. Let's just mistype it and go ahead and send it. User not found, as because since it did not match, we're just returning user not found, and the status is now 500 as opposed to the correct status, which was 200. So it's as simple as that. For the sake of this tutorial, let's add a few more functions, a few more endpoints. So basically we have the get user function. Let's add another one called create user. So basically all you have to do is change the name to create user, change the path to create user. It will take user as the payload, the user struct that we've defined previously, which just contains an email. And then it will take, the function will be called create user. Now, we don't have this function yet, so let's define the function called create user. All we have to do is basically copy this, and instead of get user handler, we'll call it create user handler. Instead of user request, I'll just take user, and then instead of doing the find user, it will create the user. In our case, all we'll need to do is create the user in the database. But since we're not going into the database in this tutorial, we'll just hardcode a string saying user created, and then we'll convert this to string. And this is what it's going to respond with. Warp reply JSON, and then result, and we'll get rid of this entire response. It has to be a reference, and that's as easy as it is. Now let's call the other function. Let's call create user. What is it complaining about? Is it because, all right, the user is not a public, so basically the user does not have the traits. So let's quickly give the traits to the user and then make it a public function. Well, let's just quickly rename it to get user handler. This is a function, and that is as simple as that. And then as you can see, it's underlined with the yellow, which means this function is never used. So we'll just have to make use of it by including it in our routes function. So it's either get user.boxed or create user.boxed, just like that. And then this function is gonna be callable from our API. We can just run it and see. So one of them is get user and the other one is create user, which takes the exact same input, just an email. And as you can see, user was created. The same thing you can do with update user and delete user, which I will cover in the next tutorial when we will go into the database and how to actually implement direct database calls from our web server API. I'm planning to do this as a 3-part series. So this is going to be the first video as a simple WordPress server. The second video will include the actual database calls, so we can have real users and we can do real data manipulation on the users, in which we'll make the fully fledged CRUD API server, again using REST. And a third part of the series will be where I will change the REST API over to GraphQL API. Most of the code will remain the same. It will still be using Warp, but I will just add an extra library called Juniper, and it will convert the insight into GraphQL. Again, I hope you found this useful, and thank you for watching. Have a good day, everyone. Keep coding.